in the early 800s. Some have said, I've seen accounts where it said the first one that was dated was 850. So it goes back and forth. So I'm just kind of rounding it out into that range.
Sure.
But to start with, let's talk about the Vikings themselves and what they did and who they were. In the 9th century, the Vikings themselves, their culture, their empire, had established very extensive trading routes. Now, the Vikings originated in Scandinavia, which today would be Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. And they had spread out across the western coast of Europe and to large parts of Eastern Europe. They were trading with or potentially raiding as far south as modern-day France. And they were going as far east as the Black and the Caspian Seas. And to give geographic reference, today that's the area of Iran, Turkey, Kazakhstan.
Yeah.
Thank you. And the evidence that they were going that far and trading that far is in Viking graves. They have found coins and jewelry from those regions. So they know they took these things, whether they got them as payment in trade or they pillaged it and pilfered it, whichever it may be.
So did they, in terms of getting to the Black Sea, for example, did they reach it exclusively by sea? Because that's another stereotype about the Vikings, which is that they were always like showing up in their ships, and then
they
sailing
did
away
get
again.
there on water, but the research shows that they probably got there via the River Volga. And the Volga runs kind of through that. It runs kind of on the border of what is modern-day Russia and then down into those countries.
Yeah.
So it's a very big river. So they were able to just go inland and sail down that, and then from there spread outwards in all the surrounding areas.
Yeah.
Well, yeah.
So they made some serious territory. They covered some serious ground.
Oh yeah.
So for a people that were considered barbarians and pirates, they were pretty effective traders. They were really good at what they did.
Or they were great at stealing things.
They were, well, that's barbarians and pirates. But they were also
the time.
They were the best seamen of their time. They were innovative in their boat designs, which let them get around faster and more efficiently. So there was a lot of things like that really helped them spread their empire when they decided that they wanted to go outwards. And there's not a lot of resources in Scandinavia to start with, so they have to go out. They have to, if they're going to build a big network or a big empire, you've got to go somewhere else to get wood, food, fur, all these things. So it makes sense why they did it.
Yeah.
So we've established how far they've got, so let's get back to the swords.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
The Ulfberht swords have all been found to bear the similar inlay like I described a little bit earlier. Like I said, there's some different inlays, which basically the differences in inlays equate to the quality of the steel that the sword was made from, but we'll get into that a little later on.
Is it kind of like a model number then, or a model name?
That there is some speculation. It's not a model name, but it may have been something to do with who made it. And we might as well just get into this. So the steel that the swords are made, and I'll get into the science part and the metallurgy of it, but the steel of the Ulfberts was superior. And like I said, something that we're not going to see again for 1,000 years.
So it's like you've got your Prada and you've got your...
No, if you remember, I said that Ulfbert is, when it's a true Ulfbert, it's going to be the cross VLFBERH cross T. There's a lot of variations from there. Sometimes it is the cross in the beginning and the cross at the end. Sometimes the cross arm of the cross actually crosses the T as well. But all of those ones that are variants have been found to be fakes. In other words, they don't have the quality of steel. Which means some guy said, hey, well, these things are really, really valuable.
Let's make some cheap knockoffs.
Let's make some knockoffs, and the steel is nowhere near as good. And for the poor guy who buys this, because they're likely illiterate, so they can't read it properly, And he's never going to come back and say, you sold me a bad sword, you sold me a fake, because the sword is going to fail.
Yeah.
And he's in battle.
Yeah.
He's going to get killed.
Yeah.
And, well, another happy customer.
Yeah, exactly. It's like,
Sure.
yeah, he's not going to come back and complain.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about this metal.
Okay.
Because I think that this seems to be one of the big parts of it.
And this is the key point to me. This is the most intriguing thing about these swords.
Okay.
So let's get into the metallurgy of it. To make steel, what you have to do is you have to heat iron ore and mix in carbon. And that carbon can be in the form of burnt wood or bone, anything that is burnt and charred, basically.
Any organic charred material.
Correct.
Okay.
The amount of carbon, as well as the actual temperature that you heat them up to and put them together at, will affect what the final product is. When metal's heated in a forge, which is the primary way that you could make steel at the time, and by a forge I mean an open fire that you're throwing heat of fuel and material on. And if you've ever seen, you see the old movies of guys back in the day, and he's got a chunk of metal stuck in there and it's glowing red hot, and then he pulls it out. That's how they did this.
We actually have 2 different forges in my garage right now.
You do?
My brother, yeah.
Could I borrow a couple of them? I mean, whichever one. No, I need to make some stuff.
No.
Yeah.
No. I don't trust you.
Yeah, you can trust me.
No.
I'll give it back.
Oh, Bert.
All right, so when you do this, the problem is that the metal doesn't actually get hot enough to truly melt. You can heat it up, you can hammer it, you can work that carbon in there, but it's not a true mix. In other words, it's not true steel. There's going to be impurities and slag and stuff like that.
Yeah.
To actually do that, you would have to take it to a point of being molten metal or molten steel. And iron ore melts at a temperature of 1500 plus degrees Celsius or 2800 degrees plus Fahrenheit. So that's really, really hot.
Yeah.
Did you check that, by the way? This seems
I did.
staggeringly high.
I did, yeah.
Really?
Yeah. It's amazingly high.
Wow.
So, like I said, instead, the metal's going to be stuck into an open fire, and it's going to get hammered down until it gets into the desired form. And I would presume the consistency that you want the metal to feel. I would guess that as you're hammering it, you can tell when it changes from one state to another, and that gets you where you want it to be. But
Sounds like a lot of work.
it is. It's a ton of work. And one of the things that you can do to metal when you work it is you can quench it, which is and we've all seen this probably on TV, where a guy sticks the hot piece of metal into water and you hear that shh, or they stick it in oil sometimes, which is the same thing, and that actually hardens the metal.
Yeah, it's tempering it.
It's tempering it, which is kind of it can be an issue, because if you do that too fast or too often, it makes it super hard.
Yeah.
But it makes it super brittle.
Yeah, I think like the ideal, you like want to do it once or maybe twice, but like more times than that, as far as I understand it, pretty much will ruin the
That's what I was on. I always thought just once, and that's it. And
I think that happens basically at the very end.
Yeah.
And also the process can be reversed. That's why you're not supposed to stick your blade into a fire or anything like that, because you can destroy the temper of the blade that way.
Yep, that's absolutely correct. So the amount of slag or impurities is the proper term, but slag is what everybody refers to it. That's in the metal or in the blade will also affect how strong it is. And we've all seen slag, whether you realize it or not. If you've ever watched somebody working metal and they're hitting it with a hammer and it's glowing red, and you see all the sparks fly off, that's the slag impurity breaking away from the material. So that's what all those sparks are, and what you're left with is then the pure hardened steel material.
But only from the surface.
Yeah,
But that's only at the surface.
Plenty of
That's
stuff on the
exactly
inside.
right. Yep. But that's not pure, true steel like we understand steel today. And at the time in Europe, the primary ore that was available was known as bog iron. Bog iron is super, super soft, and it's full of impurities. it's kind of, I think the term that we use these days would be pot metal, if
Yeah.
you've ever heard that phrase, where it's
Yeah.
something that's very soft and pliable, and it's just not good for high stress situations.
Yeah, it was never really heated properly. It probably wasn't tempered very well. Yeah.
That's crap.
Yep.
Yeah.
And so yeah, that stuff has a low carbon count, and therefore, it's a low amount of carbon in it and high impurities, so therefore it's not going to be good metal. Okay, well then let's turn around and let's look at the steel that's in the Ulfberg.
Okay.
That steel is made from extremely pure steel, and that's steel that's referred to as crucible steel. Crucible steel contains almost no slag. It's about 1 to 2% carbon, depending on which one you find. They vary in a range of 1 to 2. That steel is made by heating iron ore and carbon inside of what's called a crucible, which the easy way to think of it is just some kind of container. The container that's
Sealed.
fully
Container,
sealed. If it's done properly, yeah, it's absolutely sealed and nothing can get into it. And then what happens is, rather than sticking it in a forge, you stick it in an oven. Something that you can get extremely hot and maintain a consistent temperature, and then everything truly becomes molten metal, at which point the carbon is absorbed relatively evenly and the slag impurities are drawn away. They'll be, if I understand it correctly, the metallurgy is that it's attracted to the crucible. I don't, and I might be wrong in my description of how that works, but I do know the impurities are pulled out. What
Well,
you're-
it might be that they're lighter or heavier too, which would cause
Yeah.
a mistake to
Or,
rise.
you know, they're all on the surface, right? So
Yeah.
when you start pounding, they all flip away.
Right.
Fluff away.
Fluff
Yep.
away.
away.
Just fluff away.
Technical
I like
term,
it.
right
Technical
there.
term
Yeah.
when referring to steel.
Yep.
Yeah, fluff.
Those ovens, they get them typically to about 13 or 1400 degrees Celsius, or 2500 degrees Fahrenheit.
Wow.
You remember I said it was 1500 Celsius to 2800 Fahrenheit for the iron. When you add carbon, it lowers the melting point.
Okay.
So that's why
That's handy.
that carbon helps to get them hot. And then what happens is the crucible itself, they'll slowly let everything cool off, and then they'll shatter the crucible. They'll get it off of there, and that all the impurities that are with it, they break away, and what you're left with is an ingot of pure steel.
Handy.
And then from there, you can go ahead and work it into whatever you want it to be.
Interesting.
And one of the things that, one of the links that we're going to put out, I know that everybody will want to see, is there is a documentary done on this by Nova. And one of the really, really awesome things in that documentary is there is a guy who made a Ulfberht sword using this technique. And then they went ahead and they tested the steel that he made. And the way that you'll do a steel test is you put it into two machine-operated pliers, for lack of a better term, and they pull. When they pull apart, the metal is going to start to break at some point, whether it shatters or it cracks. And that Ulfberht steel was on par with relatively high-grade steel that we would use today. It's good quality steel. So
Yeah.
this stuff is top-notch for its day.
Yeah.
Which is why these swords were so sought after.
Yeah, absolutely. That documentary is, while long, really worth it.
Yeah, and I really
It's
enjoyed it.
Fascinating.
It's
Yeah.
absolutely fascinating, and they do a good job of explaining things. I like it. I think that they missed the mark on a few things, which is why I think that this is a good companion piece. But I reference it because that point where I saw them doing that test on that steel, it just blew my mind.
Yeah, and when they put it under the microscope as well,
Yes.
you can just see kind of the slag comparison.
Yeah, the impurities in it,
Yeah,
absolutely. Okay, so the Ulfberht swords obviously are using this high-grade steel, and it couldn't have come from local sources because that bog iron just it
Wouldn't cut it. Huh?
it wouldn't cut it. It would be impossible for somebody locally to heat that bog iron enough to get all the impurities out of it. Some testing. Oh, go ahead.
So the heating of the bog iron would have had to have been a lot higher.
It would have taken a lot longer. I mean, I think that to do this, you've got to keep these crucibles in steel for, I think it's about 8 to 12 hours, maybe longer.
Well, but not only that, but you actually have to form those ingots. I think, the idea is that you put them in a totally sealed, self-contained container. And I think the kind of idea that we're getting at is that wasn't a widely known fact in this time, as far as I understand it.
In the area.
In the area particularly, but just kind
in
of
Western
in general,
Europe,
I think crucible steel was a thing people didn't really know how to do very well until much, much later.
And it would have been much more difficult to do with the bog iron.
Yeah.
You would have ended up with less pure steel because most of it would have been, or let's say a significant portion of it would have been impurities that you would have lost.
Yeah.
So then you're out.
Yeah, so, okay.
All right.
So, in other words, they got their steel somewhere else.
Well, yeah, and they have done tests on the steel that these swords are made from, and it's been linked to mines that were in what's now modern-day Afghanistan and Iran.
Oh.
And I've also seen research that points to it coming from India, which is, again, a long ways away. So this just speaks volumes to how far the Vikings were able to get and to trade with. So yeah, I mean, it's presumable based on this that they were trading with these other peoples for these ingots of steel to go ahead and make their swords.
Yeah.
But then we get to the question of where were they taking the ingots, or what were they doing with them once they had them?
Now, is the theory that they were buying the ingots, and the ingots were already in the rough shape of a blade? Or?
No. As an ingot, an ingot is just a block.
Okay, so like a brick. Okay.
It's a brick of pure steel.
And the idea is that they were buying the ingots, not that they were buying just like the iron and taking them back and crucibling them and everything like that themselves.
Yeah, and that's where a lot of the research points. I give the Vikings more credit than I think a lot of people do. Again, everybody says they're barbarians and they're pirates and they're stupid.
Yeah.
They're not stupid people. They obviously were very clever to have gotten as far as they did and done the things they did. And it plays in. This will play into a theory that comes along later on. But I don't see why it's not possible that some Viking saw how this stuff was being made and said, now that I know how that's happening, maybe I could do that because I'm a blacksmith. So I think that's possible, but the research doesn't point to that. But it's a theory that I personally kind of think could be a potential, but there's nothing been to support it.
And we think that this wasn't something they came up with on their own. I mean, so the swords of the time in like Damascus, for instance, or in the Middle Eastern area.
Yeah, Damascus steel.
Yeah, so they...
Yes. And thank you for bringing up Damascus steel. Damascus steel is another form of crucible steel.
Okay.
It's also crucible steel, which was made in the Middle East. And if anybody ever gets a chance, I don't know if you guys have seen Damascus steel. It's beautiful.
Oh, yeah. Like
Absolutely beautiful steel.
Damascus blade knives and swords and all that stuff.
They are fantastic with the pattern work in them. So anybody who hasn't, go take a look at that stuff because it's rad.
It's beautiful and very expensive.
Yes.
And unfortunately, unlike a lot of modern steels, it rusts really easily. So you got to keep it really lubed.
Yeah, you got to keep that stuff clean.
Yeah.
Okay, so anyway, we're going to move on to our theories here of how did this sword come about and where did it come about?
Aliens.
Yeah. That's exactly right. So the first theory that is that one guy made them. One guy figured out how to make this sword, and this doesn't say where he got the material from. We're going to go ahead with the train of thought that he got it from one of their Near East neighbors and then was making the swords.
Okay.
Well, that makes sense. I mean, they all have the same inscription. All the true Ulfbert swords have the same inscription, so he could have been making those swords. And it wasn't uncommon for people to brand their swords. There are a lot of swords out there that have letters in them at the beginning that, if translated, says "made me," which translates "made by," and then it'll have the guy's name.
Well, okay. Yeah, I guess one of the things with the inlay that gets me is the crosses. Because this is a time in the world where there's this rise of kind of the Christianity happening, spreading, and I know the Vikings were really, really resistant to that. So the fact that somebody would incorporate the kind of Christian-esque cross,
and that's very strange. You're right.
into this really Viking.
This unique sword that you only find with the Vikings.
And it kind of feels like them like kind of almost appropriating it, almost like saying like, oh yeah, you guys believe this thing? Well, cool. We're gonna put